Picture this. It is a Tuesday. You know it is a Tuesday because your phone told you, and your phone told you because somewhere in the infrastructure of modern civilization, someone decided that days needed names, and that this particular one would be called Tuesday, and that on Tuesdays, like all the other days except Saturday and Sunday, you are supposed to be somewhere doing something that someone else decided is worth compensating you for. You have a job. The job has hours. The hours have tasks. The tasks have deadlines. The deadlines produce stress. The stress requires management. The management of the stress requires money. The money comes from the job. You see how this works. Now imagine that none of that exists. No Tuesday, no job, no boss, no inbox, no performance review, no commute, no desk, no quarterly targets, no passive-aggressive email about kitchen cleanliness in the break room, just you, the landscape, the people around you, and the open question of what to do with your time. If your first reaction is something like, "That sounds incredible," you are having the same reaction most people have for about 30 seconds before the follow-up question arrives. But what would you actually do? What did people do specifically for the hundreds of thousands of years that humans existed before anyone invented employment, money, agriculture, or the concept of a work week? Because here is the assumption that almost everyone carries, usually without examining it, that ancient life must have been consumed entirely by survival, that prehistoric people woke up, spent every waking hour desperately searching for food, narrowly avoided being eaten by something large, collapsed from exhaustion, and did it all again tomorrow. A grinding, relentless, joyless struggle with no room for anything else. That assumption is wrong. Demonstrably, fascinatingly, almost embarrassingly wrong. And unpacking exactly how wrong it is and what ancient humans were actually doing with their days is one of the most surprising journeys you can take through human history. Start with the most fundamental question. How much time did ancient hunter-gatherers actually spend obtaining food? This question was largely unanswered and largely unasked until the 1960s, when anthropologist Marshall Sahlins synthesized fieldwork conducted with contemporary hunter-gatherer groups and produced a conclusion so counterintuitive that it generated controversy for decades afterward. Sahlins observed that the hunter-gatherer groups studied, including the Kungsan of the Kalahari and Australian Aboriginal groups, spent somewhere between 2 and 5 hours per day in food-obtaining activities. Not 12 hours, not all day, 2 to 5 hours on average to meet their nutritional needs. Sahlins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, using affluent not in the sense of material wealth, but in the sense of having sufficient time and resources for the things that mattered. The argument was that hunter-gatherers were affluent in time in a way that agricultural and industrial societies were not, because their needs were modest, their environment provided them, and the work required to extract those provisions from the environment was limited. This finding has been debated, refined, and complicated by subsequent researchers, and it is worth being clear that the picture is not uniformly rosy. There were days of hard physical effort. There were periods of scarcity when food was difficult to find. There were seasonal variations that required more intensive work at certain times. The average conceals real variation, but the basic structural point has held up. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers were not spending 8 to 10 hours a day in labor equivalent to what industrialized workers perform. The food acquisition work was real, demanding, and skilled, but it was not consuming every available hour, which means there were, in fact, substantial portions of the day that needed to be filled with something else. So what was the something else? The most significant category of ancient human daily activity that modern people consistently underestimate is social interaction, and underestimating it fundamentally misunderstands what human social life actually is and what it evolved to do. Humans are among the most intensely social animals that have ever existed. Our brains are disproportionately large relative to our body size compared to other animals, and a substantial portion of that extra neural capacity is dedicated to managing social relationships, tracking who is allied with whom, remembering past interactions, predicting future behavior, understanding intentions behind actions, navigating the extraordinarily complex web of relationships that defines human group life. This investment in social cognition is not accidental. It was selected for over millions of years because social competence was survival critical in the environments our ancestors inhabited. Being well connected in a hunter-gatherer group was not a personality trait or a lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy. A person with strong social bonds had allies who would share food during scarcity, who would care for them when sick or injured, who would support their interests in group decisions, and who would defend them against threats from within and outside the group. A person with weak social bonds had none of those things. The social network was the safety net, and maintaining it required investment. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups spend enormous amounts of time in activities we might loosely classify as socializing, but which are actually highly functional social maintenance behaviors. Conversation, storytelling, laughter, communal meals, grooming, play, music, and the kind of extended relaxed social presence that signals connection and trust between individuals. These activities are not downtime between real activities. They are among the primary activities, performing essential functions for group cohesion and individual well-being. Studies of the Chosh Kungsan found that adults spent multiple hours each day in conversation, storytelling, and social visiting. They talked about food, about other people, about the events of the day, about memories, about plans, about the behavior of animals they had observed, about conflicts and their resolution, about funny things that had happened. They told story, they argued, they gossiped, they laughed, frequently and at length. Gossiping, specifically, deserves rehabilitation from its modern reputation as a trivial or even negative activity, because in the context of small hunter-gatherer groups, information about the behavior, intentions, reliability, and character of other group members was among the most valuable information that existed. Knowing who could be trusted, who had behaved badly, who was reliable in a crisis, who was generous and who was not, was knowledge that directly affected survival outcomes. The social information exchanged in what looks like casual conversation was operationally important in ways that have no direct modern equivalent. Food preparation is a category of ancient daily activity that warrants separate discussion from food acquisition because the time and skill involved were substantial and because the social context in which food preparation happened was itself significant. Hunting and gathering produce raw materials. Turning those materials into food that can be safely consumed, efficiently digested, and shared across a group is a separate body of work with its own demands. Processing plant foods, many of which require preparation to remove toxins or increase digestibility, occupied significant time, particularly for the women in most studied hunter-gatherer groups. Grinding seeds and tubers, preparing animal hides and sinew alongside meat, controlling and maintaining fire, managing the food resources of the camp, and ensuring that preparation happened in ways that were appropriate to the group's cultural expectations, all of this was skilled work that took time and knowledge accumulated over years of learning. Food preparation was also consistently social in hunter-gatherer contexts. It happened in groups accompanied by conversation, singing, and the kind of parallel social activity that characterizes work that is done in community. The communal preparation and sharing of food was one of the primary contexts in which social bonds were maintained and demonstrated, and the obligations surrounding food sharing in hunter-gatherer groups were among the most significant social rules governing group life. Who shared with whom, how generously, with what acknowledgement, and with what expectation of reciprocity, were matters of considerable social importance embedded in the ordinary activity of preparing and distributing food. Tool making and maintenance occupied a category of ancient daily activity that is easier to document than many others because tools survive in the archaeological record. What the artifacts tell us is that tool production was considerably more skilled, time-consuming, and cognitively demanding than the finished products suggest to modern eyes. The production of a sophisticated stone tool, a carefully shaped hand axe, or a set of finely worked projectile points required knowledge of specific stone types and their fracture properties, skilled technique developed through extended practice, and the ability to visualize and work toward an intended form through a series of carefully controlled removal steps. Flint knapping, as it is known, is technically demanding enough that modern experimental archaeologists spend years developing proficiency, and the quality of some ancient tool production suggests levels of skill that required substantial investment to achieve. Beyond the production of new tools, existing tools required maintenance, resharpening, hafting onto new handles when handles broke, replacement of components, and the assessment of when a tool had been worked to the point of no longer being serviceable. This maintenance work was regular and ongoing, woven into the fabric of daily activity rather than being a special event. The making of items beyond stone tools, which dominated the archaeological record simply by being the most durable material, would have occupied significant time as well. Wooden tools, leather, plant fiber cordage, baskets, nets, containers, clothing in environments where clothing was necessary, and the various other material items that hunter-gatherer life required were all produced by hand from raw materials, each representing accumulated skill and invested time. Movement was a major category of ancient daily time use that sits in an interesting analytical position because it was both functional and something more than purely functional. Hunter-gatherer groups move regularly, substantially, over large areas. The Datkung San of the Kalahari, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer groups, moved camp roughly 6 times per year and ranged over territories of several hundred square kilometers. Other groups moved more frequently. Movement served the obvious function of accessing food resources across a wide area, but it also served social functions, territorial functions, and what might be described as environmental management functions. Moving through the landscape was also, in a sense, how hunter-gatherers read and understood their world. The detailed ecological knowledge that effective foraging required, knowledge of plant locations by season, of animal movement patterns, of water sources, of landmarks, of the signs that indicated what had happened recently in a given area, was built up through repeated movement through the same landscape over years and decades. Walking through familiar territory was simultaneously travel, learning, memory retrieval, and knowledge updating. The cognitive load of this kind of ecological attention is worth emphasizing, because it is radically different from what most modern movement involves. A hunter-gatherer moving through their territory was constantly reading the environment for information, the condition of plant food sources, the signs of animal presence and movement, the state of water sources, the weather indicators, the behavior of birds and other animals that provided indirect information about conditions. This was not passive travel. It was active attention requiring sustained cognitive engagement. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Play deserves its own section, because the dismissal of play as a trivial or childhood-only activity significantly misrepresents what it is and what it was in ancient human life. Play is a category of behavior that appears across all mammals and in particularly rich forms in social mammals with large brains. It serves multiple developmental and social functions, it develops physical skills through low-stakes practice, it teaches social rules through interaction, it builds and tests relationships, it develops cognitive flexibility through the imaginative and problem-solving elements that characterize complex play, and it produces neurological rewards that motivate the behavior and thereby ensure its continuation. In hunter-gatherer groups, play was not limited to children. Adults played, regularly and at length. Games involving physical skill, games of strategy, games of chance, competitive games between individuals and groups were features of life across virtually every studied hunter-gatherer group. Some of these games had obvious skill development functions. Games involving throwing accuracy, running, wrestling, and other physical capacities that mattered in hunting and conflict were practiced playfully in ways that maintained and developed those capacities. But play also served social functions that extended beyond skill development. Games involving competition between groups created structured contexts for intergroup interaction that could build relationships and demonstrate capabilities without the stakes of actual conflict. Games played within groups allowed for social bonding and the expression of individual personality in contexts where the outcome was low stakes and humor was expected. Losing a game was not a serious social event. Winning one in a particularly impressive way could be celebrated. The emotional register of play, different from the focused seriousness of hunting or the social complexity of conflict resolution, was itself a valued feature of group life. Music and dance are so universal across human cultures that their presence in ancient human life can be inferred with high confidence, even where direct evidence is limited. Archaeological evidence for musical instruments, including flutes made from bone and ivory, dates to at least 40,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. And the cognitive capacities for music, rhythm, and dance are present across all studied human populations without exception. Music and communal movement, meaning dance in its broadest sense, served functions in hunter-gatherer life that went beyond entertainment in the way we understand that term. Communal singing and rhythmic movement have documented physiological effects. They synchronize the nervous systems of participants in ways that produce feelings of social connection and trust. They generate endorphin release that provides genuine analgesic and mood-elevating effects, and they create shared emotional experience that builds group cohesion in ways that individual interaction cannot. not. The healing dances of the Akkung-san, described extensively by anthropologists who studied the group, were complex, sustained, all-night communal events involving music, rhythmic movement, and states of altered consciousness induced by the sustained physical effort and social intensity of the gathering. These events were healing ceremonies, but the healing they performed was as much social and psychological as physical, maintaining the cohesion and emotional health of the group through periodic collective experience of intense shared feeling. Regular music making in less ceremonially elaborate forms occurred in the daily context of camp life. Songs accompanying work, lullabies accompanying childcare, music played in the evening around fires when the day's work was done and the group was gathered. The sonic environment of a hunter-gatherer camp was not silent. It was regularly musical in ways that served the constant maintenance of social connection and emotional regulation. The transmission of knowledge from older to younger generations occupied substantial time and attention in ancient human daily life. And it is worth understanding how different this process was from formal education as modern societies practice it. In the absence of writing, all knowledge existed in human memory, and could be transmitted only through direct teaching and observation. The accumulated ecological knowledge of a hunter-gatherer group built up over generations of experience in a specific landscape, the knowledge of which plants were edible and which were toxic, which animal behaviors indicated what, which weather signs predicted what conditions, which injuries could be treated with which plants, how to make each tool, how to navigate by which landmarks, was not stored anywhere except in the minds of the people who carried it. Ensuring that this knowledge transferred reliably to the next generation was therefore a fundamental survival concern. Children learned through sustained observation and practice alongside competent adults, through stories that encoded ecological and social knowledge in memorable narrative form, through play that practiced skills in low-stakes contexts, and through direct instruction when explicit teaching was appropriate. Adults invested time in this transmission continuously, not in dedicated teaching sessions separated from other activities, but woven into the fabric of daily life so that learning happened in the context of doing. This is why the storytelling that consumed so many hours of hunter-gatherer evening time was not entertainment in the sense of being separate from practical life. Stories were one of the primary knowledge transmission technologies available in a pre-literate society. The stories that explained why certain animals behaved as they did, that encoded the locations of water sources or the seasonal patterns of plant availability, that established the social rules governing group conduct through narrative examples of what happened to people who violated those rules, were operational knowledge in narrative form. Sitting around a fire listening to an elder tell stories was, in the cognitive economy of a pre-literate group, something more like education and training than like Netflix. Spiritual and ritual practice occupied daily and periodic time in ancient human life in ways that are documented across all studied hunter-gatherer groups and visible in the archaeological record through art, burial practice, and the material evidence of ceremony. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites across Europe and beyond, dating to between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, represent enormous investments of time and skill in the creation of images in locations that were often deep inside cave systems requiring hours of travel by firelight to reach. The paintings are not casual decoration. They represent deliberate, serious, creative, and potentially ceremonial effort by individuals with high levels of artistic skill working in difficult conditions on surfaces that were not visible to everyday life. Someone spent a long time on those paintings, and someone or many people went to considerable effort to see them. Whatever the full meaning and function of cave art, which remains debated, the investment of time and effort in its creation is not consistent with the idea of people too consumed by survival to have space for anything else. These were people with time, skill, motivation, and cultural frameworks that made the creation of sophisticated art in remote locations meaningful enough to be worth the investment. Burial of the dead, which appears in the human record from at least 100,000 years ago, required time and effort that went beyond practical necessity, and its presence indicates that ancient humans had frameworks for thinking about death, about the status of the dead, and about appropriate responses to loss that motivated significant expenditure of collective effort. The deliberate placement of bodies, the inclusion of grave goods, the evidence of flowers and ochre at some burial sites, all speak to cultural practices around death that occupied real time and reflected sophisticated inner and communal life. Rest, Actual unstructured rest was a feature of ancient daily life in ways that modern life has substantially reduced and that deserve recognition as a distinct category of activity rather than merely the absence of activity. Hunter-gatherer groups observed across multiple studies spent significant portions of the day in what researchers described as resting, sitting, lounging, and engaging in low-intensity social interaction without any clear goal-directed activity. Midday rest in warm climates, when the heat made active effort uncomfortable and food acquisition less efficient, was common. Extended relaxation at the end of successful food acquisition days, when needs were met and no immediate demand was pressing, was also documented. This is not laziness. It is the appropriate behavior of an organism that has met its current needs and is now recovering, processing, and maintaining itself. The human nervous system and body require genuine rest periods for physical recovery, memory consolidation, stress regulation, and the maintenance of cognitive function. The scheduled rest deprivation that characterizes modern working life, where legitimate rest is compressed into brief periods and treated as secondary to productive activity, is historically anomalous. Ancient humans rested when they had met their needs and resting made sense. They were not anxious about the time they spent doing this. The cultural framework that makes modern people feel vaguely guilty about unproductive time, that measures days by their output and judges rest as something that must be earned, did not exist. Time was not money because money did not exist. Rest was not laziness because the concept of work requiring compensation and compensation requiring continuous effort had not been invented. Here is the full picture, assembled from everything above, and it is worth sitting with because of what it implies about the relationship between human nature and the way modern life is organized. Ancient humans, across the long span of prehistory before agriculture and permanent settlement, spent their days doing things that the human brain and body were actually designed to do. They moved substantial distances through environments they knew intimately and attended to carefully. They engaged in deep, sustained, functionally important social interaction. They created things with their hands using accumulated skill. They played, sang, danced, and made art. They told stories. They taught their children by doing things alongside them. They rested when rest was appropriate. They sat around fires in the evening in the company of people they had known their whole lives and talked about what had happened that day and what the world meant and what was funny about it. They did not have jobs, they had lives. And the distinction between those two things, which should perhaps be more visible than it currently is in modern culture, is one of the things that the study of ancient human daily life makes unavoidably clear. The restlessness, the sense of meaninglessness, the social disconnection, the chronic physical deterioration from sedentary indoor existence, the sleep disruption, the attention fragmentation, the pervasive low-grade dissatisfaction that characterizes significant portions of modern industrialized populations. These are not simply personal failures or chemical imbalances or character weaknesses. They are, at least in part, the predictable output of placing a brain and body designed for one set of conditions into a radically different environment and expecting them to function as though nothing has changed. Ancient humans did not have jobs. They had something that looked considerably more like what the human animal was built for. The irony is that we look back at their lives and call them primitive, while carrying phones that track our productivity and wondering why we feel so tired. They would have found that very funny, probably around the fire in the evening with everyone else listening.